Okay. No, you're fine.
something that waits and listens for the sound of the genuine in yourself. Nobody like you has ever been born, and no one like you will ever be born again. You are the only one. If you cannot hear the sound of the genuine within you, you will never find whatever it is for which you are searching. And if you hear it and then do not follow it, it was better that you had never been born. You are the only you that has ever lived. Your idiom is the only idiom of its kind in all the existences. And if you cannot hear the sound of the genuine in you, you will all of your life spend your days on the ends of strings that somebody else pulls. So the burden of what I have to say to you is, what is your name? Who are you, and can you find a way to hear the sound of the genuine in yourself? There are so many voices and noises going on inside of you, so many echoes of all sorts, so many internalizing of the rumble and the traffic going on in your minds, the confusions, the disorders by which your environment is peopled, that I wonder if you can get still enough, not quiet enough, still enough to hear rumbling up from your unique and essential idiom, the sound of the genuine in you. I don't know if you can, but this is your assignment. The sound of the genuine is flowing through you. Don't be deceived and thrown off by all the noises that are a part even of your dreams and your ambitions, that you don't hear the sound of the genuine in you. Because that is the only true guide you will ever have. And if you don't have that, you don't have a thing. Cultivate the discipline of listening to the sound of the genuine in yourself.
So we'll move to your respective circles, and we have a ton of reflection and sharing on that reading with one another. And questions, reflection questions are
What stood out to you all? What do you think he's getting at on that?
I don't know what it's getting at, but the substitute pricing of the genuine, it worked real well.
Yeah,
I mean, you gotta wait to the sound of price and you were.
well, and maybe capitalize the change in right and recognize that is, in a sense, it's the name of God. Because God is what is truly and what is truly honest, what is saying. Think about Jesus, he's used to be true. Right? You know, it's that thing that makes sense that I think what helps to be in this way is kind of the logical answer. It helps us to think a little bit different.
Other things that allows it to be useful for anybody else who may not be putting a capital letter on G, it doesn't put a name, but it does. Person, not genuine there's another two ways.
Well, I think we're down to maybe abstract that.
I am a genuine person. That's what it is. So you see this thing? That's very true. So we used to see genuine attitudes.
I've spent a lot of it. Help recognize that. Instead of trying to thoughts at work. We realize it's also about how speech people their faith may not be. That people listen to them, or maybe someone who claims to be a Christian, but their faith isn't really sort of God's or their idea. God is working, you whether or not recognize it, we're calling for that is whether you recognize this or not. The only question you are what else you don't hear this. Yeah. Saying no to the good and embrace the bad.
Now I communicate, I understand.
Saying no to the
Who you are, because we need to. How often do you
some of the things that are urgent, we only ever did what was urgent, we never do what was important. So what is the difference still mean? Famous line is called
so that you can sit there and hear
and it wasn't Elijah's flight running from his. That story is a weird one. He was the victor, he was the guy who defeated the. All right, so the second question we have is how do you feel about helping people discover the sound genuine sound?
Hear the voice of God.
Let's say in a manner in which they can be yourself.
Often we kind of they call them generic. Yes, well, right, you really call instructions, really call ministry. But we struggle with the idea of a diversity of callings to this Christ calling unique that person is outside the gospel.
Nobody is like you. So you have to do what God's calling is. What is God calling you? Listen to the voice of God. If God says to that,
Church.
you do that every day, every aspect of your life. That's what God said. When people say, oh, I heard that.
I'm not really asking, well, like, we're pretty small, we're going to say, well, I say, I feel like, we all do this, but I feel like the job is like class. It's not that they agree with that because, at least it's just, living in context, I feel like my people are, well, it's the same for my people feel, the more unlikely they are to go out in the world. But I also feel like knowing the nature of the serve of making them otherwise they're not going to go out and explore areas and explore those spaces. A lot of, sometimes in the church we become complacent with presence, right? It almost becomes a places. I'm saying, no, I like everything that's happening right here, in this time, in this day, in this space. And so I think there's a balance to it of creating space where they can be who they are, and then a space where they have people in the church who can push them into a space of reaching out into a lot of things of encouragement. So you don't see why especially guys who really want to hear he said something.
And still, when I first started doing it,
So often they always recognize playing back and take advantage of and stop that.
well, then it says, you know,
It's really how much we change our structure. We just got to remind ourselves, we see somebody who, all of a sudden something recoils from that person, but then someone who is no one like that person is everything more, and no one like you is everything more. Yeah.
And you see the
their contentedness. So you recognize
every person.
the actual, nature of genuine. They're comfortable. They're genuine. It's not mine. And that become their sense of expression within the church. Is they're more than happy to kind of stay behind that and say, yeah, this is what we want to do, this is who we want to be. So my perspective is that Christ calls us to be. And so maybe surrounding the source of the senses, how consider, or we allow your sound to be influenced by the theme that comes along?
I think, we recognize we don't answer those questions. I think sometimes traveling, wanting us to hear too much from us here about any situation. Our lives goes a little more than I would in some of that. You know, say, what I don't know those things, and I need to offer you raise for this person. Because who knows?
That's what we have to listen to our team. Say, all right, man, what do I do with this?
Something
How do I do it?
give us a.
One question I feel a lot of, why do you think it is important to cultivate space and spaces now? Let's back up. What would it mean to cultivate space? How would we do that? Cultivate space.
That's our question is not what you want. What you think.
To build relationships and identify exercise. You know, I watched that. There's a season where I was looking at there's also a season to create space and not relationship. Those, when you find that, all of those.
Show God's grace to people. Space is not actually a form. Your image of what God wants.
Well, I think the other thing that happens with that is as we listen and relationships and are able to help receive. Those of you who are pastors all the time, we got to twist the arm, we got to fill that slot, right? We need another person as we are seeing, or we gotta have somebody, fill this nurture slot, whatever.
Well, that's, yeah, and ourselves. Pastor tool. My tool for that is if you aim to listen to when you fall short, you're forgiven. Right, so at least that means you can start scratching. You can start with one slate, crank it up, try again. Right, no big deal, no big deal.
numbers, people get to share about Jesus. How incredible is that? You got it totally wrong. It wasn't people who said, oh, we were waiting for him to bust out. You know, people who got off. And that's where really so about ways that we honestly fail as we're trying to follow God.
But then I feel whereas that somehow patient God, he loves to make you receive. And that's the same patient for yourself. But we don't take time to get relationships. It's just like trying to take.
I say, there's someone I've seen that something that we want. Experience this relationship for some of those people is trying to say, one of the things. Most of
Well, and that's that brings us back to the circle of this. How do we cultivate space? Cultivate space doesn't force anybody. Social process. But then it was in the practice. Well, one of the first things that we talk about in the process is having the courage to know, the courage to say, there are places in my life that I'm not really ourselves. It's courage. Not everybody's in a place where they're having the courage to do that. And so cultivating space is about saying, okay, I want to create an opportunity. If you're ready, to look hard at yourself, look hard at God. And we still do a relationship thing in hopes that they will get there.
But I do have I don't think to do what I want. I was asking this concept. If I had to do it,
We begin to see
I
that
usually just know. I don't consider it. Oh, the Lord said, no, that's not what we're doing.
on itself, and it's not based on more open to the inside. And then you're left with kind of rolling time, hopefully be open to engage that part of the world that may not necessarily be experience. About that, the need to organization actually becomes part of our story. And it becomes part of less on the trust to be able to reach. And I think what is key, what makes it does, so on the action, it's about you may have one, two, great people, about 60 people on Sunday morning. And see God. Well, I am the Son. Okay, so all 6 million is what I'm like. But it's like, well, it always makes it there. But I said, what if we foster this relationship in this case with those people who are going out? And what if it looks like that? Now I have people who are vetting. I'm connected to their spiritual care, and I'm still there. And then you can bring up guys that's not the genuine instead of even like and all 60 of these people. And just say those there's also 2 reasons why, but another there was no God. So you all feel like you know what makes you fall. Oh, yeah, it's really just makes my say, yeah, that's really exciting.
But we had a good conversation. And she said, I don't know your name, you're short for it. She's had a relationship here. Not a lot, but she's kind of being
I know what you're going it's
Showing up.
we often try and work ourselves.
If you are making,
We don't realize that. Like, I'm trying to remember, we had just had a really bad day. And one of our youth is I was and just Betty just sit there like, here, she's and then it's got to be all Part of it is those things are easy. That's one of the challenges in the church. Is what gets made. This is our metric. This is why I hate this. But you got to work hard. It's a lot easier to say, oh, you're here when you come
I can count the number of people, even though it's just they graduated. Or I consider God working, I consider God working. But no matter how big or small. We're coming back here.
Just like David when he numbered tribes.
To
development. We talk about both inside the church, but more importantly, outside of the church and what that looks like. And this next shift is really helping us think about shifting from informing. This is kind of our messaging, how we go about interacting with our neighbors and our neighborhood and the community surrounding us, to that empowerment side of it. And most organizations agree that residents of a community play an important part in the community's well-being. We all agree, right? That it's really important that the community itself be an active agent. When I talk to the police, to faith communities, to health departments, civic associations, schools, community-based organizations, human services agencies, and local businesses, everyone says we want community engagement, right? But there's a big hole. When I say, how many residents do you have engaged? We haven't figured that out yet. So everyone knows that this is important, right? But not very many have an effective strategy. So there's been a lot of research and a whole lot of groups thinking about this particular problem. And this was developed by IAP, their public participation spectrum. Now there's a lot of words and you have it printed out in front of you, and we're not going to read it. I wanted you to have it for reference. Because when you start thinking about how you're communicating to the community, I want you to, these can be summarized in this way. So when you're operating out of the inform lens, it sounds like this to the community. We're going to have this meeting. This is our plan. Now, how many of you been to public meetings and somebody will stand up and they'll show you their plan, right? They'll call it community engagement. We had a meeting, 50 neighbors came and we told them our plan. Isn't that it? Are we done? We check the box and we move on. The consult box sounds more like this. Here's our plan. How can we make our plan better? Inviting people to speak into the process. Most groups kind of stay right there. Now the community gave us some suggestions. We should do it on Tuesday night instead of Wednesday night. We listened. The next level is involve. What do you want to help us achieve our plan? So here's our plan. What can we do to improve it? You want to come join our team. So we're moving into that involve space. Collaborate. Sounds like this. How can we work together to create and achieve a shared plan? So moving into that co-creation space. If we're trying to get all the way to empower, empower sounds like this. What is your plan and how can we help you? Language is incredibly important when we're thinking about messaging. When you went out and you did the 5-question survey, that third question, if you could do anything, what would you do? So we're trying to listen for the plan that is already being cultivated before we ever get there. And that's a really, really hard thing to do. So I encourage you to keep this spectrum in front of you. And when you're looking at the materials that you're creating about whatever it is you're going to be doing, you're using language that gets you into that empowered side of it. If you start your conversation on this end and you think over time you're going to shift it, it's 10 times harder. Because already their perception is there's this group of churches and they're coming into Petersburg to do something for us. And you don't want to start your conversation with that perception. So what we're going to do now is actually get out your homework at your tables, same groups, and share what was the plan, what was the dream that people were sharing. So that question number 3 will be the focus of your conversation. So as you go around, if you'll share what kinds of ideas and visions were kind of bubbling up through your listening exercise. Is everybody clear?
I have to.
Andrew, did y'all have an interesting story or anybody have anything?
Karen had some good reflections. You want to share a little bit about what you've heard?
I haven't finished, but I got about 4 of them done. Of the 4, 1 is moving, and another one gave me someone else to talk to, which I haven't talked to yet. But all of them pretty much were on the same page that what they really loved about the community was its smallness. But what they miss is the community piece that has kind of left it in the last 10, 15 years. So when the town doctor left, or the hardware store left, these places have left the community, and more things like Dollar General have kind of changed the atmosphere, and they want that community aspect back where there are little shops or whatever where money kind of stays in.
Okay, so thinking about micro business development, how do we bring our stuff together, and there's a group thinking about the same thing in Pamplin. Like, how could you have like one storefront, but you might have multiple people selling their stuff out of one common, like a general store feel.
And that's kind of a spread of the one that I talked.
Very interesting, very cool. So this table, Petersburg, y'all hearing any dreams in Petersburg? Anybody get a chance to use the survey?
Part of our conversation around the table is when we were here in Stoke, the concept of taking, going back to the prosperity that Petersburg once was, and then we create that in the Midway, which led us to look at creating space for conversation to be more inclusive of just not having a dream, but others that don't share with them.
So that rich history as a catalyst for conversations about the future, right? So in Brooklyn Park had this rich history, and allowing that oral storytelling was one of the best community building things I've ever seen, because people have that memory of what it means to be community, and your group too is kind of like what we know what it is, and if you can define it together, you start to shape what you want, right? We know what we lost, and if we can talk about it, we get to know each other, we get to build place. That's hey. So you're starting. So this is a long process. So my recommendation is at least at no less than 30 surveys of residents, not grass toppers, not people leading organizations that don't necessarily live in the neighborhood, but actual residents, 30 to 50. Now, if you do more than 50, sometimes it takes so long that by the time you reach back out, they don't remember you. So trying to get those done in a relative, if you can get it done in 3 to 6 months, when you do a summer dream catcher project, which is what Chester did, it's very intense for 8 weeks. But the students were able to partner with the church to do 50 surveys in 8 weeks. That's short enough that when you call them back and say, remember when I talked to you 8 weeks ago and you said if you could do anything, you would do this, and if other people cared about it, you would join in. Well, guess what? 6 other people cared about it, so you want to come? But they still remember your conversation. If it takes a year to circle back, they're going to remember you. So that's kind of a rule of thumb. With the school partnership group, because this group is forming partnerships, didn't really have an opportunity to talk, but I did share at Meadowbrook High School, the students are doing the listening project there, and the top 2 things the students at Meadowbrook care about enough that they would do something about is nasty lunch. So far, nasty lunch, number 1. They want more tasty options. And number 2 is relationships between teachers, administration, and students. They want the teachers to get what it's really like to be a student, and they focus on non-English speaking students. So it's a special, particular demographic. So over time, you'll start to hear some commonalities. You'll start to hear some threads, but I wouldn't start to like label or put, this is the direction we're going until you have at least 30. Now in Hillside Court, we did 30, and those first 30, 29 said gun violence. I mean, it was so overwhelmingly the issue. They did do 50 and 49 said gun violence. But most of the time, you're going to see 3 or 4 that kind of bubble up. Once you have your 30 to 50 surveys done, you'll do a convening meeting. You'll come into a space similar to this. What we do is we put those big sticky note things on the wall, and it might say micro business, or it might say celebrate the history, or it might say whatever those big buckets, and you might put 5 on the wall. Everyone gets a smiley face, and then everybody votes on the idea that they would care enough about that they would get involved. And then you can start to see what emerges out of that. So that's where you end up with your couple of top ideas. Then when you actually get into that action planning, so nasty lunch, let's say that was number 1 for Meadowbrook. And you start to say, well, what would that look like? Well, I wish we had a salad bar. Okay, well, I happen to know there's 2 nonprofits working on that in Richmond, but what could the students do? So remember how this is something we can do by ourselves? This is something we need help. This is something only other people can do. So you would come up with all the ways you might be able to address the school lunch issue. Could be awareness raising. Maybe the kids make a video about what it's really like. They said they have less than 5 minutes to eat their food because they're moving like this. What if they put together an awareness campaign around that to talk about the importance of social time? I mean, there's a whole lot of things that students can do, but they probably aren't going to change the menu by themselves, so they would need some other help. Those things that only other people can do, that would be another category. So the ultimate decision would rest with the school district as to timing and so forth. So you go through this process of figuring out what do we have power over. We talked a lot about power last time. And then you pick the thing with the low lying fruit, like the easy, don't pick the hardest thing. Because what you want is success. You want as fast a success as you can get. So pick something tangible that would have they'd have a sense of pride and achievement. So that's the process once you go through this. So how did y'all, those of you who had a chance to do the survey, how did you feel about what you were learning?
Well, it was interesting, over the years we've built relationships with a lot of these people, but just the new stories that I heard, it kind of just grew that relationship in a little bit deeper.
So it was a good relationship building tool, things you never, because you're asking questions that we don't, in the normal course of life, don't really ask people, right? And how do y'all feel about using the survey tool? Do you have a chance to use it? Is it helpful? Feel good about it? Not so sure?
I think we can use it once we define the community somewhere.
Yeah.
We're still.
So y'all are still way up here. Yep, got it. Yep. And it is important that you bring that geography down to a manageable place. Yeah. Okay. So we've got a lot of people, we're all in different places on this journey. And I think, so this table has context. You know where you would do this. In general, you've got a connecting place. This table, there's the potential to great partnerships and things already happening. You guys are in the stage of prayer, okay? Ask the Lord of the harvest, and you're going to stay with them until you get that clarity of place. So all of us being prayerful for one another, but especially the Petersburg team, I think there's a whole lot of discernment that has to go on. So this next shift from participants to owners, should we pause here and do lunch, or should we move through this shift and then do lunch? I mean, like maybe 30 minutes? Like 12:15, is everybody good till 12:15 and then break, or does that sound good? So this slide is, or this shift is really thinking about what we measure. So the last information is about how we speak. It's about how we frame what we're doing and how the community hears it. This is really about how do we know we're making progress. So our goal, we talked about discovering the gifts, and then we talked about developing leaders. How do we know if we're developing leaders? And how do we know that what we're doing is ultimately going to change the community? So this is this particular diagram is from the Joint Community Resilience Assessment Collaboration. I never can remember that. It's the CCRAM. So it's an international group of researchers, and what they did is they looked across the globe at communities that were hit by similar trauma, and they looked at acute trauma. So those are things like hurricanes and fires and things that just kind of came out of the blue and traumatized a community. They looked at why did some of those communities, those that thrived and were resilient, and those that failed. And they wanted to understand what is the difference, what makes some communities rise in adversity and others just really crumble. And what they saw was that leadership was one of those 5 factors they identified. Collective efficacy. So efficacy is the belief that you can affect change. So if a community believes that they can do something, obviously they're more likely to get something done. The third is social trust. So communities that had a sense of shared understanding and trust of each other that were already kind of connected in some way did fare better than communities where there was a lot of distrust that was there before the traumatic event. That there was some kind of attachment to place where people thought of their communities, this is my home, and I'm willing to do what I need to do to make my home a better place. The last they identified as preparedness. So those communities that had some kind of disaster response plan or some kind of strategy for communicating when something traumatic happened, those communities fared better. So what we did is we looked at the ABCD Institute's best practices and their research. We looked at our own experience in working in communities that were experiencing chronic trauma. So Petersburg has experienced chronic trauma. It's not that you were just hit last week with a hurricane, it's that you've had non-stop disinvestment, you've had issues of unemployment, you have substance abuse, there's just a whole lot going on, and it's just constant. Same is true with a lot of the communities that we're working in. Generally, it's going to be in this chronic trauma. So when we think about that, what they saw in the acute research is just leadership, and it could come from city council, it could come from larger structures. When you're thinking about neighborhood level and chronic, the role of residents, because that chronic stuff happens 24/7, and there needs to be some response agent there all the time, somebody that's rooted in community. The next, that collective efficacy, exactly the same, cohesion and social trust. So it's not just that I trust you, it's that we have some kind of connection to each other. That civic engagement and attachment to place. So how do we know people are attached to their place? We don't go around and say, are you attached to this place? I mean, that doesn't, they invest. They're civically engaged in some way, shape, or form. They're showing up at civic association meetings or something. And then that common cause or shared plan of action. So you can't develop a shared plan of, now you can develop a plan for a chronic weather event, right? Like that's, you kind of know what that might look like. With chronic trauma, it's so many arms. Like, is it employment? Is it substance? You know, all these pieces, how do you prepare? You have to know your common cause. You have to know the thing that the community is likely to connect to. So that common cause and shared plan of action is what we've been talking about developing. So that 5-question survey, if you could do anything to strengthen your community, what would you do? That's speaking to common cause. And you're listening for what is that thing that people care enough about that they want to get together around. So that's our model for community strengthening, and what we measure those 5 things. And I'm going to talk to you about how do you capture the data that tells you whether or not you're progressing. So resilient communities are empowered communities. So these are our 5, that shared plan of action, social trust, collective efficacy, investment, and resident leaders. And this is the model. So these numbers represent outcome metrics for one of the neighborhoods I'm working in. Now, this is a more mature community, but these ratios are consistent. And those of you, how many of you guys think about your congregation and think about these ratios? So if I'm in a community, this is Brooklyn Park, we have 400 participants. These are people who will show up at a block club and eat a hot dog. These are people who show up on Sunday morning and listen to you and eat your donuts and drink your coffee. Okay, they're participants. They're in the room. The next level is engaged. Now, engagement happens when someone is serving on a Sunday school team, or they're somehow a part of a larger, they're contributing something to the equation. So in a neighborhood, they're serving on an action team. So maybe they're on clean sweep and they're picking up trash once a month. Now they're engaged. They're giving something back to the process. A leader is the person who is running the team. And our recommendation is that there's always 2 leaders. These are volunteers. Volunteers are hard to find. If you can find a Betty that'll stay forever, that's great, but volunteers are hard. So if you have co-leaders. So in Brooklyn Park, we have 12 action teams, 2 leaders per team. And then out of that, we formed the neighborhood steering team. We have 6 that are serving on the board. So these are your owners. These are the people who are making the decision about how the money gets spent, what grants are going to apply for, what processes. Those are your owners, your resident owners. That ratio it's about a 25% at each level. So, John, you said you calculated 0.03%. He took the population at Chester United Methodist Church and the 8 on the Go team and actually did the math. So this is your math problem. If you can find, so right now what we're doing is we're trying to find people who would either engage or help lead. And over time, you're going to start to identify the owners. So those owners are the people who are sacrificing something through the process, and they're really, really vested in the process. So how do we know if we've got a healthy development effort? We look at the split. So when I'm working with resident leaders and they have an action team and everybody's a P. You know, they got 20 Ps showing up every single time, but no one is moving into engaging in anything, and there's no leadership. Usually what that means is that leader isn't inviting. They're the people who say, I can do it, don't worry about it, I'll do it. And they're servant's heart, but they're not inviting people to move into deeper levels of engagement. So by looking at this, you can start to see. Now, sometimes I'll have a lot of leaders and I have no Ps. If you have no Ps, you're not growing leaders, right? So what is happening a lot of times is these groups, they become the holy huddle. We like it like this. We like our A. We don't want to invite new people. We're real happy just the way we are. Do we really have to have other people come in? Have y'all ever experienced that? Yeah. So just simply by looking at and naming levels of engagement, you can see why things aren't working or working well. So I hope this is a helpful tool to you. Those of you who might potentially move into grant writing, So I have a feeling somehow in Petersburg, whatever you guys take on may require some funding at some point. This is the metric we use with funders. So this is really hard stuff to measure. And funders want to know, are you making progress? And how do we know we're making progress? Because we're growing leaders and we have very tangible benchmarks for what that means. So as you're managing expectations of your church, you've got to define success. So if they say success means people are going to come to church on Sunday, they're going to get really frustrated with this process, right? When no one shows up on Sunday. But if you define success as we're growing leaders, we're helping people discover the sound of the genuine in themselves and become strong community leaders, you're going to manage some of that expectation. And then we're not going to measure by P's. How many, so I've talked to so many churches through the years and they're like, yeah, our food pantry is really successful. We have 400 people come every week. And that's the measure of success. And that's where it's going to stay unless you define success in a different way. If you say, 100 of them are coming back and serving through the ministry and 24 of them are leading something, that tells you that level of engagement. Is that helpful? It helped us tremendously to define success and to define it in a way that's tangible. And also I'm an accountant, so I like the numbers. John's an accountant. That's not really your background, but he does crunch numbers. So participant to owner and thinking about the processes that you need to put in place to move people along that spectrum. So I use this analogy a lot. That was really thinking about the community side. And now I want you to put on your pastor hat, the one you didn't take off yet, still on, and think about what does this mean in our church context as it relates to the way we think about mission. So what I watch is a lot of churches, this is kind of our baby pool, right? So we give people a whole lot of opportunities here. What this sounds like is, can you bring a can of peaches? Can you bring some school supplies? We're doing this. Can you bring this in? How do we create opportunities to move to that deeper level? So P level is safe. I can drop my peaches off and I'm still in my comfort place. This E level, okay, now this looks more like Betty, and Betty's actually going into the schools and meeting kids and actually engaged in the relationship building. And Clara named relationship is really where you start to move people out of that safe place of hiding behind the turkey box and actually knowing someone's name and getting to know their story and starting to discover what makes them special. That O level is when see, pastors, this is where you want to be, right? Up here. And everybody's in the pole just doing their thing, and you're like, good job, Katie! When people start to freestyle, when people start to take something and say, so Betty's been doing the buddy system, and let's say that Betty starts to hear a consistent theme of the parents wish they knew each other. And Betty says, you know what? I think I'm going to have a parent meet and greet day. And and Betty just goes off the grid and just starts doing her thing. That's what we celebrate. Because the Spirit is moving people to create new opportunities. And when we create new opportunities, we create new P-level opportunities and new E-level opportunities so that we're expanding our pond and getting more and more people into the water. Helpful? Think about? So when you think about your missions engagement, are you only offering people P-level opportunities? Because you can get big numbers. So I have a church I'm coaching right now. And the missions chair called me, and she says, I'm so frustrated because we're celebrating that 200 people are going to go do this P-level thing. Because that's what we celebrate, big numbers. And I cannot get my church to think about how to invite people into these deeper levels. And we have to create channels. There has to be pathways into we have to be intentional. They don't just automatically. So as you think about what you're offering, trying to get a healthy balance, and I think of mission as spiritual formation. If all we offer people is the kiddie pool, and then we're frustrated because they're not very spiritually deep, I wonder if we pull people, and we talked about moving people in our circle out of the comfort zone, that's where we grow. We don't really grow very much if we just stay in the kiddie pool. Lunch is smelling good. I'll talk faster. So this leadership development process, so how do we move a P to an E to an O? There has to be opportunities. There has to be intentional ways of people engaging at deeper levels. But we also need a process for identifying them. So simply asking, so if you're in the context of a community and you ask people on my block, who on this block cares about this community, they're going to say Miss Anita, or they're going to say Miss BJ. Ask people, who else cares about this school? Who else cares about Petersburg? They're going to help you identify. Existing engagement opportunities. So when we sit in our circles, you kind of start to hear people's passion. So if it's a feeding program, being very observant on who is offering to help clear the table. Through asset mapping, the listening process, which we talked a lot about last time, now we identify them, there has to be some form of equipping. So all of us inherited doing for people. Everybody. It doesn't matter if you live in a wealthy community or a lower income community. So when I first started working in Hillside, they were like, let's take sandwiches to the homeless. Like that if we're going to serve together, that was the go-to. So there has to be some way of equipping around what we've been talking about. And what might that look like to do a empowered neighbor academy in Petersburg to help equip the students at Meadowbrook or at Matoaka. There has to be an equipping piece of that. And there has to be that on the neighbor side, but there also has to be that on your church side. So you guys have gone through 15 hours of shifting, lens shifting. Now, if you go back and you recruit and then you turn them loose in the community, they're going to do what they've always done because that's all we know, right? So what is that equipping piece going to look like at the church-based level? And then there has to be, what I've seen is that everything gets reinforced through connection to peers. So one of the reasons we put you guys in these tables the way we did, and we're breaking you guys back into groups, is you're sharing with each other, and that peer-to-peer sharing actually helps to reinforce the learning, more so than a talking head in the front of the room. So how are you building connections? So let's say, Karen, you have leader A is going to be doing something special around children for your food pantry participants, and somebody's really thinking about senior adults, and another person is thinking about transportation and can people get here, and you have a prayer leader over here. How do you bring them together in a leadership table? Even if it's just 15 minutes before the event, like if the event is a feeding event, to support and encourage one another and creating that sense of community for your leaders. And that's what Sylvia does with you guys, bringing you guys together periodically so that you have that peer-to-peer. My experience has been the training gives you common language. It's really, really important. We're all speaking the same. We all know what success looks like. We all know what this means. But it doesn't sustain. It leaks out. People forget. They'll start to go back to the way things were before. It's the connection piece, the reflection, the kind of holding each other to a particular objective or goal or vision for the future. That's what really sustains this kind of work. So as you get into that equipping, Audrey and Andrew and I will be following this cohort for 9 months at least, as you start to move to that equipping. So I know if Woods were going to do some training for kids at Matoaka, we would connect them to come and watch how the kids are going to be trained in Greenlee. So that, and then if, let's say that, Chris, your church was gonna watch the Meadowbrook kids and maybe invite the Meadowbrook kids to train the kids from Manchester. How can we leverage the assets in the room from those that are a little bit, so Karen, what Karen's doing, it may be something that you could then train Belmont. Like, how can we connect you guys that are a little bit further in the process to then train the group coming right behind you? You guys are going to create a discernment process of how to do this in a very mindful, spirit-led way. And there's a lot of churches, not in this room, who can't name place that will be able to create models. So our hope is that there is a model for how to develop something around food. There's a model around how to best connect through youth and schools. And there's a model for how to embrace a larger area and fine definition. And all three of us will be with the through this whole process. So what P-level engagement opportunities are available for your church members? What E-level, what O-level, and then how do you feel about your current levels of engagement, and how might you invite people to a deeper level? So we'll use this as kind of our reflection at our table. Table conversation. Very good. So I'm going to turn it over to whoever knows how to transition this to lunch. So we're going to make another shift. So we're going to be thinking about that shift from a missions committee to what it means to be a beloved community, and how we need to rethink a couple of different things before we move out into community. We talked this before lunch about developing leaders. Over the next hour or so, we're going to talk about team building and how we go about nurturing small connecting places. So when we're in groups of 6 or 8, sitting in our circles of 6 to 8, when I say team, that's the size I'm talking about. We're talking about more intimate types of spaces. It's very difficult to get to know, I know Andrew was saying 60 people, to know the sound of the genuine in 60 people is not likely to happen. To understand, deeply understand 6 to 8 people is possible, and you can go much deeper. So the smaller the team, the deeper the level of engagement. The one-on-one, like Betty was talking about with a student, just that one-on-one, and Claire had an opportunity to connect one-on-one with one of the members of their ministry. How much more meaningful even those very, very small spaces. So when you see team, don't think huge. Don't think the whole church is going to go on the journey. So building teams. To start the team building process, so we're moving to the kind of the end of our group training into that implementation. As you're thinking about implementation, the first thing that you have to decide is who is the project coordinator. Who is kind of the owner of this development venture? Is it a member of the church? Is it you? Is it the pastor? Is it the missions cheerleader? Is it somebody who's already involved in a particular ministry? Or is it a partner? So Meadowbrook High School, the project coordinator for Meadowbrook High School's venture is Jennifer Hilliard. I'm coaching and training Jennifer through CIS. The project coordinator in Greenlee is Michelle. So she's with the YMCA. So occasionally we have already trained people whose job is to make these kinds of projects happen. But by and large, it's going to be folks from your congregation or yourself. So finding that project coordinator, and their role isn't to do all this. Their role is to create spaces where the teams emerge. So they're crafting the experience so that people can find that sound of the genuine in themselves. The next piece of this equation is identifying those community leaders. We do a lot with high school students because we believe that they're great assets. One, they have capacity. So a lot of times in the summertime, they're not super busy. They also are very optimistic, so they tend to think they can change the world. Now, they tend to think they can change the world overnight, and sometimes that's not so helpful, but their optimism can be contagious. And I think Chester, those who were on the Chester team, Audrey and Sylvia, saw that it kind of was contagious, the things the kids started dreaming about, and it kind of like flowed over into the congregation. So when we think about community leaders, don't just limit it to the adults. Also think about, is there a high school student that might be a part of the leadership team that you're putting together? That first team, that project coordinator is putting together, remember we're thinking 6 to 8, is called the steering team, neighborhood steering team. If you're in a school setting, it might be such and such elementary school team. You want to make sure that the community leader would be a parent from that school, let's say. You don't want to stack this steering team with church members because then it becomes your church's thing. So in these early stage, your project coordinator and a co-coordinator may be the only people in the early stages that are visible in the community context, because you want people to start to identify the project with 1 or 2 people, not this mass. The other thing that happens is if you go in mass, let's say you spend 20 people from your churches, it doesn't feel like they need you. I mean, you need them. It's like, oh, well, you guys got this. You got 20 people. You don't need me. So be real careful when you're putting together the early teams that you've got 6 to 8 from the specific community, 2, maybe 3 when you're forming the steering team. So in the case of Chester, we started with it was just really Sylvia, myself, Megan from the neighborhood, and she started identifying the kids. And before we connected the broader group from Chester, it was me and Essie from my organization and those kids. And Sylvia would pop in and out. And then we brought in, when they were ready, when we had a little team coalesced, and they were ready to start the listening, then we brought in mentors. So it was a one-to-one relationship. But in the beginning, it was just very light. It was just a couple of us trying to build connections to the kids. Does that make sense? So you've got that steering team, and that steering team is going to morph over time, because you really haven't had a chance to see if you've really got owners, right? Like the process we talked about earlier. So I've had people join the steering team and realize it really wasn't for them, but you need that resident voice in the beginning. Once you've got this neighborhood steering team, and this steering team says, hey, we want to do a listening project, then you will start to talk to some of those outside volunteers. So, for example, Meadowbrook High School, she's got 8 students. They're the steering team in Meadowbrook High. They actually want to be involved in some listening projects outside of Meadowbrook. So Audrey is identifying some neighborhood engagement opportunities, and we called the THIA to see, could you guys maybe help mentor? So now you're connecting those outside volunteers because there's a neighborhood project that's emerging. There's an opportunity for engagement. What I call that group, those outside volunteers working with that project coordinator, I call them the dream team. So the dream team exists to support the objective that's coming out of this neighborhood steering team. Their job is to release those dreams. Once you sometimes you'll get these action teams first before you end up with a dream team. Sometimes you can't get the action teams because you don't have what you need yet. So for example, if the kids in Meadowbrook want to engage in listening projects around their neighborhood, they can't do it by themselves. They need adults to accompany them. And that's kind of where we are right now. So we need to know that there are adults that will accompany them before they can start their listening team. But let's say that we find the mentors we need, they're gonna form a community listening team. So in Greenlee, she has 3 students that are ready to start listening, but they can't launch because they don't have the adult capacity yet. So that's where the churches can start to help make that dream of doing the project possible. Then you'll start to see these action teams start to take shape, and there'll be a leader from each one of those teams. And then those action teams are the ones reaching out to the neighborhood. So you're not putting out flyers with your church name on it saying, come to this big block party hosted by our church. It's coming from those action teams. So ABCD neighborhood residents are hosting a block club sponsored by or in collaboration with, but you want the ownership to always be the residents, that it's not owned by an outside entity. You're going to get a lot more buy-in, a lot more long-term ownership from those who are coming through the process. So that's what it looks like. So ultimately, you end up with several different types of teams. But that first team, and this is the hardest one to build, is your steering team and making sure you have authentic, resident, or community level voices in it. So what we're going to do is actually practice a process for how to start to shape culture within those teams. And we did something similar with Sound of the Genuine. I'm going to have Audrey read for us the call to be a dream releaser. And then we're going to go back into our circles and we're going to do a similar activity that we did with the other.
The call to be a dream releaser. Wayne was a child growing up on an army base in Japan. One day, his family went for a ride outside the base. When they stopped for lunch, an old man at a booth caught his attention. He was selling tiny birds that resembled a finch in bamboo cages. He asked the man how much and was shocked to learn they were only 100 yen each, about 36 cents. It was too good a deal to pass up, so he bought one. As he was walking back to show off the purchase to his family, the old man called out to him in Japanese, "Don't forget to bring the cage back when you're done." "Bring back the cage when I'm done? I'm not planning to eat the thing. I just wanted to take it home as a pet," Wayne replied. "Oh no," said the old man, "you don't understand. The 100 yen is to take the bird to the edge of the valley and release it so it will be able to fly freely." This was the last thing this young boy wanted to do. He felt that was the dumbest thing he'd ever heard of. But he did not have much of a choice. The old man was keeping close watch to make sure he got his cage back. So he walked over to the edge of the ravine, overlooking the valley below, opened the cage door, and gave the bird a couple of nudges. Edging its way suspiciously toward the door of the cage, it suddenly launched into flight with a jubilant chorus of tweets and whistles. The world is laden with treasures, dreams, and precious gifts. Yet too many precious souls are going to their graves with songs left unsung, gifts yet unwrapped, and dreams unreleased. We all have dream in our hearts, just waiting to be released.
I invite you all to return to the circles that we were in earlier. And here are reflection questions. Anybody else read Doing Church as a Team, Wayne Cordero? It's a great book. I mean, thank you. So we're on our last shift. Yay! And we're thinking about this team building process. And I wanted to share this tool. So anybody familiar with Theory U? The idea of Theory U?
Someone told me about it 2 days ago. It was really interesting.
So a bunch of people, researchers, got together and they said, what is the process by which strangers enter a room, and over time, they coalesce around a shared vision, and they create action. And so they plotted out the process that you can take groups through to bring about shared action. And I'm going to get my water because I haven't my drinks. Do you think I need water? Coffee. So what they recognized, and I thought, so John gets a gold star because the first step is creating a safe space, which is exactly what he said when we sat down to reflect on our first reading. So in thinking about, we enter into this process and we all enter in with our individual stories. So when we're sitting in the circle the first time, we're saying, I remember one time I did this and I did this, and so it's just a whole bunch, and that's what we've been hearing all day, right? Like individual stories. If we create that safe space, people feel comfortable enough to start to share the genuine in them, to share their authentic stories. But we have that safe space is also about slowing down. So that first reading, that Howard Thurman reading, he was talking about not only can you get still enough, can you get quiet enough? What happens when we start to think about mission, when we start to think about doing, missions is about doing, right? We get a lot of energy. And this movement, this is a movement, it requires energy. But when you first enter, thank you so very much. When you first enter into the space, creating a time of reflection, creating a time of sitting as still and as quiet and as reflective as you can when you start your process. So today we have been practicing in our two kind of reflective readings, we've been practicing Theory U. Now this was renamed by the founder now Forum for Theological Education because they wanted to understand how our pastoral leaders who are activists shaped. How does that process look? So FTE created this acronym of CARE. So create safe space, ask self-awakening questions, reflect theologically. Now this says collectively because I use this slide in secular trainings as well. Reflect theologically, enact the next faithful step. So we're going to walk through what does this process look like. So when you're creating a safe space, think about the physical space. Now when you're sitting at your tables, you've got a table between you, you've got pens, there's distance in this space. One of the reasons why we set up, we removed the barriers between us, and this is kind of an artificial space, but you're more vulnerable when we remove the distance. When we get into the circles, you can't hide, right? You can't sit in Twitter or whatever you're doing under the table because you're exposed. And there's something about circles that create equal. There's an equal dynamic in terms of the sharing. So you want to try to set your room up like that. So if you're having a community meeting, think circles. And think, okay, you're not going to stand up at the front with your agenda. You're going to sit down and you're going to ask questions. If you can find reflective pieces, both the pieces that we use today use metaphor. Very heavy on metaphor. Neither of them were overtly spiritual, but both were deeply spiritual. So if you can start to get at the heartbeat of what's happening in a room, if you can find readings that are like that, stories that invite you to assign meaning. And if your group was like my group, everybody heard something different in the story. Everybody, a different word jumped out, a different idea, a different learning. And I've done that reading at least 100 times, and every single time I learn something new from the group. The group assigns the meaning. So you're co-creating meaning together, which is really important from that idea of co-creation. Food is super important. If you guys didn't have food here, you would have lost us, right? Like we were staying for those cookies. They were amazing. And we talked about the reflective piece, metaphor, and imagination. So that's part of that creating of that safe space. So really think about how your room is set up and create as much of a living room feel as you can. That next is asking self-awakening questions. So a self-awakening question are questions that open people up to ideas and ways of being that may be new or challenging. The goal is to uncover each person's individual story, but begin to see a new communal story that's forming. In this process, we often discover beautiful insights into different cultures and an understanding that helps us expand our understanding and appreciation for diverse groups of people. This awareness leads to group awareness, which helps to break down walls that separate us. So, for example, we did an oral history project, and the question, the self-awakening question that emerged is integration a cause worth fighting for, or simply a failed social experiment in the capital of the Confederacy? And that grew out of the oral history of the first woman to integrate, and she shared that she felt like she sacrificed her whole childhood for integration, that it was a failed social experiment. So we showed her story, her testimony of her experience, and then had the room discuss this awakening question. And as someone, as a white citizen of this country, I thought the automatic answer, well, of course it was a cause worth fighting for. And what I heard from the other side, from a lot of my African American friends, and especially those who went through this period, it did more harm, at least in the community level and the local level. It broke down so many of the protections that these students had experienced. It was fascinating how my perspective shifted because of the diverse nature of the conversation. So that's a pretty deep question. I wouldn't recommend one that deep on your first encounter with community. But thinking about how do we challenge ourselves to think different and to invite people to wrestle. So we talked about, when you're putting together your self-awakening questions, this is called an ORID format that tries to start with the simplest and take you to the deepest. So if you have a reflective piece, you have a story you share, a video or whatever, if you start with the what stood out to you? Everybody should be able to name a what. If everybody had a shared experience, you all heard Audrey read, we all heard something, there's some what. So in this one, you can actually literally go around a circle. Everybody share what stood out to you, because that one's pretty easy to answer. Gut goes deeper. Our head is a pretty easy thing for us to grasp. Our feelings are harder. But when we start to be able to name our feelings, we move the room into a deeper place. And we start to be more vulnerable. And we start to say, I'm feeling a little anxious about this. Or I'm really excited about this. We start to really understand where's the spirit moving in a room. And giving space to talk about how we feel. And then the importance is the so what. Why is it important that we talk about the sound of the genuine or dream releasing? So what? Why the importance? If a group doesn't think something's important, they're likely not to act on it. But if people can name it for themselves, I can stand in the front of the room and say, it's really important that you guys go do this, right? It's not going to sink in. But when you're in a circle and you name it for yourself, it's that co-discovery. I see it's important. Somebody named the sound of the genuine in me, so it is important that I go name the sound of the genuine in somebody else. You start to see more ownership. And the last, and we didn't do the now what, so it might be something like how much you go about helping people discover the sound of the genuine. So this moves us into the action side of things. And today we were just kind of experimenting with this process. So We're going to get to that in just a little bit. So that is just a way, a rule of thumb for thinking about shaping a reflective, space to start to really dig deeper. The role of dream releaser is really to free people from cages that are stifling their deepest dreams and desires. And I used to think that my role was to kind of open those cage doors and nudge people out. And what I've discovered is that the cages are locked from the inside. And when we can start to create space, where people start to think about what's holding them, why am I stuck in this space, they can start to craft that key for themselves and be able to really move more fully into that flight. And the jubilant chorus of bells and whistles that we want to hear. So this next piece, this reflect collectively or theologically, if I'm in a group, so if I'm in a secular group, I'm in a community, and let's say we did the sound of the dream releaser, then I would say, okay, we just heard from each other what stood out to us and how we feel about it. And I would be up here on the board and I would be writing down, someone brought up cultural awareness, importance of choice, I'd be listing out those things that came up here. And then I would step back and I would say, what can we learn from this together? So we all have our perspective of a reading, but what's the collective voice that comes out of this? So, and I don't want to but just about wanting to get out of the cage, I had this yes, I want to fly too, right? Ready to fly, So maybe that's the theme, we're ready to fly. And then that becomes kind of that mantra for, okay, what would it mean if we all feel like we're ready to fly? What would it mean? And then we move into that and enact the next faithful steps. I'm going to give you another tool that bridges between the collective and the action here in just a little bit. But naming our communal interpretation of our individual experience. That's where you start to pull the individual stories into something that is ours. And this circle, this intersection, what you're trying to get to is kind of that Kairos moment where a group has this shared understanding. So did Petersburg have a Kairos burning bushes in the sanctuary, or not so much? Or Jerry, you seem to be the burning bush guy. Just that moment where you feel the Spirit of God move, kind of in that coalescing of shared understanding of that. It doesn't always have to be great clarity. It's just God was in that thing, that moment.
The reason that text me, Mike and I were prison ministry called Irish. We've been very first in prison.
Okay.
So our training in Irish is parallel things.
So having that experience is allowing you to see potential in Petersburg. There's so much potential in Joseph. I started out in prison industry as well. Being able to see that parallel.
Well, we're seeing a correlation between the people who are how they feel lost in old darkness of hope, and Petersburg was seen the same way with that fire.
Yeah. Very interesting. It's an interesting insight. So as you're thinking about, people starting to see connections between them. So that's really what that reflects collectively or theologically. Now, if I'm with a group of church leaders, I might say, where did y'all see God at work this week? We all list where we saw God at work. Okay, what are we feeling? How is God showing us our path forward collectively? So we can use a little bit different language. I really like the first Howard Thurman. Where did you come alive this week? From working with a group of leaders in more second. Where did you come alive this week? people would tell me, that points to the sound of the genuine, right? I came alive because I got to train this amazing group. Well, my identity as a trainer is reinforced. So you start to like understand the passion and what people get excited about. So that's the reflect collectively. So you take what you've shared individually and how does it speak to the larger group? So you're trying to draw meaning out of these individual experiences. What part of this is in order for us to accept the what's next, a lot of times we have to let go of what's there. And so part of this exercise is thinking about, in order for us to embrace what needs to be, what do we need to release? And that dream releaser kind of metaphor, I know in our group, really thinking about the letting go, the allowing things to be messy. And then that what's coming is that envisioning the future. So what I'm going to share with you guys is an exercise that I do with groups when they're first forming to start to think about how they move from where they are to where they want to be. So the first part is called a victory circle. So all you do, you can take a big sheet of paper, you draw a giant circle on it, and then you challenge people to think, okay, the year is 2025, and we have been wildly successful as a group in fueling resident-led community strengthening movement. What do you see? Think visual. What do you see? So that's my question. We have been wildly successful. Whatever it is that's on your heart right now, you went out there and you did it, and it was wildly successful. What do you guys see? Oh, maybe these were in the back because they're really late, and these are over here because we're good. All right, somebody's way ahead of me. All right, there we go. There's our victory circle. What do we see?
Big prison break.
Prison break.
Big prison break. Tore down the walls.
And so the walls are all crumbled. Okay? What else do we see? I think that's a great 11 minutes. We see justice. And what does that look like?
Lack of poverty, education. One. Safety. Joy.
Smiles.
I'm trying to make a nose. Okay, no nose.
I see high school students graduating from high school and gone to college and they come back to Houston to help people.
Yep.
Amen.
And they're coming back to their neighborhood. That's a beautiful vision. We can't get to where we want to go until we can see it, until we can start to name it, until we can start to anticipate the possibility that's there. So when you're working in a community, start with vision. If we were wildly successful, what would we be able to do? Then the next part of that process is where are we? So if this is where we want to be, what is our present reality? And what you do is you draw that outside the circle. So what's our present reality?
Poverty, failed education, distrust, unemployment,
And frowns.
family violence,
Round.
No.
And I missed someone. Y'all get the average. So that's our present. We don't want to dismiss the harsh reality of the context that we're in. So we know where we want to go. Now these are very, very broad. Now I want you to go back to the listening process. So you would have done your listening, you would have had your convening meeting, you would have had your 3 to 5 things that emerged. There would have been sticky notes on something, right? So this is, we're starting with a blank page. You would actually be starting this process. It might be safety. So safety, I just looked at an asset map for Southland Apartments, and the number 1 was safety. So it'd be a little bit more defined. So it might say, understanding what people were saying was speeders, drug dealing, break-ins. They had, safety was defined in a lot of places, and then no one cares. Slow police, like there would be more definition to this so that you can start your action plan. So with safety, you would then brainstorm, okay? If we could do anything together, what would we do to bring about a safer community? And you would make a list of all the things that people said they would do. And then you would assign an A, B, or C. A, we can do it ourselves. B, we need some help. C, only other people can do. Okay, now we've narrowed it down even more. Okay, let's think about our A's. Who here cares enough about these actions that you would take a lead role? And that's how you start to transition from this, which is enormous and it feels overwhelming and like we'll never get anywhere. You get a little more refined, a little more refined, a little more refined until you come up with that strategy that really clear. So one of the safety solutions, one of the best practices is actually block by block organizing, because when neighbors know each other, especially if it's a single family residence type of community. So my neighborhood, safety was number 1. So one of the first things we did is started block clubs. So we had to identify a block club leader. And then it turned into, okay, now we need to train people. Now we're going to do these block parties. We do porch parties with beautiful porches in our neighborhood. Now everybody's starting to know each other. Now we're starting to identify who doesn't belong on the street. And there was a shooting, there was a murder on our block. So we had a vigil, and everybody came out and prayed and said, we're not going to let this scare us back into our houses. So those kinds of things start to get more and more defined. So that's this tool. Start with the vision, name the present reality, and then move into how do we move from where we are to where we want to be. These care practices, the last of the care practices is enacting the next fatal step. So you never leave a meeting without really clear next steps and as detailed as you can get. So if we were having a conversation about safety and Miss Anita said, I'll coordinate a block club. Okay, what is the next faithful step? I'm going to talk to these 5 people. So she would list out those 5 people. And then Miss BJ may say, well, I'll make the potato salad if you host the party. My husband's always the grill man. So there would be like this list of very specific things that people will enact between the meeting you're in and your next meeting. So keep things as small and tangible as you can, but as specific and assigned. And if your name is beside them all, that's not a good thing. So try to spread and a lot of times allowing things not to happen is an important part of the growth process of saying, if this doesn't, I mean, you guys all know this, right? Like, if you step in the void, people are going to keep expecting you to step in the void. So you just have to let it sit there for a little bit. And sometimes it's just not the right time. It doesn't happen all that often that I get all the way to the point of this happened in Brooklyn Park. We had a whole bunch of people interested in music. So we brought all the musicians together and we felt like music could be a way of really bringing people down to the commercial corridor because we're trying to do economic revitalization. All these musicians in the room, probably 10 or so, good size. And we get down to the end, and no one was leaving. I mean, it was just like, well, if you build it, well, come. I'll bring my guitar. I'll bring my this. You build it. No, I'm like, I can build this thing. You know, so sometimes, you know, that'll happen. And then what happened is we put a pause button on it, and we're like, we're just not going to do that right now. And a couple of years later, they connected it to another event that they call Taste of Brooklyn Park. And the musicians came to that event and did a jam session during the Taste of Brooklyn Park that somebody else built. So it's not always that it's a bad idea, it's time hasn't come or its partner hasn't arrived yet. So that's the E and the care practices. So you guys have this in your handout, those care practices, that theory piece. And that's the last of our shifts, is to really think about creating this beloved community and how to use culture, how to use food, and setting up your space, and reflective pieces that frame a conversation to get a little bit deeper than, okay, nuts and bolts, how do we get there? So we're just going to conclude with some reflective questions as you think about today. What stood out to you guys from the conversation today, or actually throughout this, since this is our last session together?
I've had this, didn't know what I was thinking about, but I've had this thing in the back of my head. We've been for so many years just doing, and I've seen incidences where we were led, instead of doing, to assist or to be a part of, and the mission has been so much more successful. Like we talked about sitting down at the meeting at the home show, sitting down with the people at the meal, talking with them, sharing the meal, rather than just serving the food and leaving. The thought's been back there, but I think we filled in a lot of the holes that I had. Thank you.
Well, thank you for sharing. I think I heard.
I think we started broad and we came down, we have specifics now. Get action.
That's what I was hoping, is everybody got enough clarity that when you walk out, it's like, okay, I know my next faithful step, and you're all in different phases of the journey, right? Which just makes this one a little bit hard, because some of you guys are ready to go, and some of you are ready to pray. And that is an action, and that's it. Others, what stood out to you from either overall or today's conversation?
I think for me anyway, it has changed the way I look at doing things that positively impact the community that I live in. I mean, in the past, we've always looked at, what can we do to help these people, and that's not a very positive way of doing it. So it's expanded my outlook on what can I do as a person, what can we do as a community to make things better in Wakefield, instead of just, that process of handing food out, it is a very, there's a wall there, and I don't think it's a wall that God likes, as a matter of fact, I know he doesn't. So, in the want to help, sometimes we ignore those things. We have been so impacted culturally on this is what we're going to do to help people that we can't step outside of that box and look at really what can we do to help.
And it's a hard shift, and just realize that every single person inherits what we inherit. It's not that somehow we got it mixed up. We just put the lenses on and we were given. So when you go back to your church or you're working with another nonprofit, most people are operating out of a 2-4 model. And this is an education process that people have to go through, but it's important. We're all on a journey, right? I'm still constantly learning how to make that shift.
I think a lot of this reinforces relationship. It's really about the relationship, whether it's church, a community, or an individual. It's about that relationship. And until we get in those relationships, we cannot grow together.
Exactly. We shouldn't move into action until we have authentic. Otherwise, it feels almost like an assault. You know, people doing to a group instead of this. Relationships. So how are y'all feeling about asset-based approaches? I mean, some of you guys, it might be a small shift. Some of you guys, it may be a radical shift. But overall, the ability to apply some of these principles. How do you feel about it?
I think it was exactly what we were missing. And you were missing something, but I didn't know what it was, and this is a good answer.
Wonderful. I can't wait to see. I want to follow along with all of you guys and see what it looks like. You guys have context. You have a small, well-defined neighborhood. I mean, everything that you need to take it pretty fast relative to a lot of the groups that don't have that clarity. Thank you, Legend. How are you feeling about it?
We're just waking up.
I feel like I should ask, yeah, everybody's.
But, I mean, my ladies look dwindled, but I think we're waking up. And through trying little things, I know that if you shoot for the middle, that you're destined to fail, except for maybe not. And so we're not going to do ABCD to the fullest extent. However, having our eyes open to ministry with instead of just ministry to has got them thinking, and we're doing experiments, which I like experiments. And it may be in the middle, but at least we're shooting for the middle. So we'll see what happens in the next 3 years.
Well, and those baby steps toward the width, the relationship, my hope is we can capture some of the stories, because there's a lot of congregations that don't even have access. Yeah,
we're building access slowly, and we're just seeing where it goes.
Yeah,
that's where we're at.
Thank you. Everybody else feeling okay about it? What benefits and challenges do you see to actually implementing some of this in your context?
So I love your comment about the birthdays and that days may be blocked.
Yeah.
And have you ever tried to take a prison?
So we've got this cage theme going here. So
we can't go back. I mean, I think it becomes an analogy that we got to help people how to free themselves.
yeah, and that idea of liberty and freedom, I mean, I've given a lot of thought. So, and hope. When we look at social movements, Saul Alinsky's organizing methodology is there has to be an enemy, and you have to fight against the enemy, and that social change happens from a fight. John McKnight, so he was trained by Alinsky, which is that inherited model, believed that our passion is what can fuel a movement. And I think the passion for freedom and liberty and hope, when we feel oppressed, when we feel caged, whether we're holding the key or not, if we can help people tap into that being free. And Betty said something, and I have to share with, they're both gone, but Betty said, I can't be silent anymore. I've been through a lot, and I held it in, and I can't be silent anymore. I think that kind of releasing is super important. Sylvia?
I think timing is really important too, that we really need to be careful in this, that we don't leave here like, I'm going to do this. Something about the reading, I just look at it on the heart about working with gang members, and the message came again and again and
relationship with others, we find ourselves, and, you know, sometimes we're the ones that keep the locked pages on us and on other people. I just think, you know, it's so important to discern God's timing and to not go like a horse that knocks people over. Right. And it needs to be respectful and being with people changes us, and it just might change somebody else too.
So I did my sabbatical out on 22 acres in the middle of nowhere in the winter time, and now spring is here. And one thing that just keeps being reinforced in my time of reflection is the importance of the right season. You know, we cannot make those peaches. I mean, I want to eat those peaches. They're only they're big right now. But waiting for the timing, and that is not in our control. And that
even John Wesley, you know, he was in the midst of doing ministry when his heart was strangely inclined. You know, so God surprises us and others in seasons when we don't even expect it. So it's such a delight to maybe journal the journey and just praise God for every person and every situation where you see the presence of God.
Well, and I would like, so part of what cultivating those stories, whether or not they're stories of wait or they're stories of go, but sharing that, you guys sharing that in some way with each other as you start to discern where is the Spirit moving. I know it inspires me to keep listening when I hear stories of how other people are experiencing those opportunities. So I hope you guys will do that. So our next step, so we talked about applying the principles. Real briefly, I just want to mention partnership development. Partnership development happens after a community names what they're trying to achieve. So you build the teams, you decide maybe safety is one of them, and maybe you need to partner with Boogaloo's Bar and Grill down the street to host a meeting to have your block connectors cover something. But that comes much later. And the reason why I want to make sure I touch on this is a lot of groups, when I looked at Petersburg, there are 1,000,001 institutions in Petersburg. A lot of people doing great things in Petersburg. If you start with the partners, you're going to, you might possibly miss what the community is saying. And I watched this happen in tiny communities where the partners are defining what's needed. You know what, Joe, you guys want to do something? Come over here and do this without worry. So being willing to push a pause at the partner level and ask, can I talk to the folks who are part of the community first? And that's not just Petersburg, that's everywhere, but I know it's going to be a challenge because there's a lot going on in Petersburg. So partnership development, at least in the ABCD model, is the last piece that goes into the puzzle. It's an important piece, though. So you have your handout. On your handout, we've done the equipping for you guys. You have to think about what does the equipping look like for your church. Then you go into the community, that development. Ultimately, the whole idea behind this is that you transfer ownership. So you don't hold on to it. It's a 3 to 5 year process. And building those four processes are ongoing. It's not like you listen once and you stop listening. These are ongoing processes that you help to build the capacity of the community group. You guys have this handout, this handout, this handout. These are just all the handouts. This one is guiding principles. So we touched on these over and over and over and over again. But relationship-oriented, number one, asset-based, community-defined. Remembering that everybody cares about something and that you discover what they care about through listening conversations, one-on-one listening conversations. You're shooting for citizen-driven, where the neighbors, the citizens, the communities in the center, and that everybody has something that they're motivated enough to act upon, and asking questions rather than giving solutions is how we discover that. Measuring success in ABCD, here's 7 measures of success. That shared vision, people using their gifts, leaders emerging, residents taking ownership, growing pride and community cohesion, less dependence on outside organizations, and the residents experience a sense of peace, joy, and shalom. And then this little handout's just a little info thing, the shifts. You got to make the shifts. Identify the gifts, build the relationships, build the community, and dreams come true. So everyone has an evaluation form, I believe, in your packet. If you guys would just take a few minutes to fill that out and leave it with Andrew, that would be wonderful. And I think we already did that. Oh, the invitation to join the community of practice. If this is something that you want to go on a journey with your fellow pastors for the, like I said, I think it's at least 9 months, 9 sessions. There'll be monthly sessions. We'll either, and Andrew's going to send out a doodle poll. We can try doing this via Skype. We can do it person to person. Let's see, we'll see where everybody is and what the preferred way of bringing us all together is going to be. But if you'll let Andrew know that when you, I think I may have even asked that on the evaluation. So thank you guys. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you. This week. And Andrew, without Andrew, we wouldn't be here.
Extra minutes to stay and help tidy things up. Many hands make something will take one person an hour to do, probably about 10 minutes.
And just a word on the learning cohort. You don't have to be in a spot where you're ready to go right now. What we're looking for is people in churches who are wanting to move towards implementation and want to be in conversation around how you make that movement. And so as we've identified, some churches are closer, some churches are further away. We're hopeful to have a group of about 10 folks. Here's the other thing. We do have some money for some implementation stuff. So if you're looking at something and you think, yeah, we want to move that way, we'd like to hire some youth to do some surveys, but we don't have the money. We have some money set aside for churches who are doing asset-based projects. If you're wanting to work on something that may not technically, I mean, kind of like you were saying, Tom, well, we got our community that we're targeting is a little larger. I'm not sure that necessarily rules you out of the cohort. So let's talk. We don't want this to be so narrowly defined that nobody participates. Is that right? And so if you're wanting to implement this in some way, form, or fashion, then let's talk about
We'll talk to Andrew so he can help define which ones really might feel like we're ready to move forward.
Do y'all have any questions? No. If you don't have any questions, then you're doing this wrong. Do y'all have any questions that we can answer today? Let me pray for us, and then we will clean up together. Lord, we're thankful for community and for communities and for the opportunity to pursue you in community and to look for how we can best be a part of the communities you've placed us in. All that we've heard is overflowing from our brains right now, God, but we trust that you are able to help us ruminate, help us to chew, and help us to discern, and help our churches to discern, Lord God, how we can be ever more fruitful as we seek to follow after you. Watch over us as we travel today, give us safe journeys, and help us, Lord, in all things to be about your business. We thank you, Lord. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen.
Now, do you want the